Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on when you're listening to this, and welcome to Taxing the Spotlight, the Saffery Sports Entertainment Podcast. I'm Pete Hackleton, partner and head of the sports entertainment team at Saffery's. Today, I'm joined again by James Taylor, a director in our team. With the Tour de France underway, we're going to be discussing the sport of cycling and what riders have to navigate outside of competing on the global stage. James has joined me on a previous episode talking about motorsport, and there are a lot of similarities between that and cycling, especially in terms of tax issues and the complexities that might arise. James, good to see you again. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Pete. Thanks for having me again. Clearly, it went okay the first time.
Very good. I'm sure you tried to emulate it this time. But let me just kick off by asking you to give everyone listening an overview of road cycling and the general landscape.
So you've said it there. I mean, road cycling is what I want to concentrate talking about today. Obviously, we have a very great pedigree of cycling in the UK at the Olympics, of track cycling, and obviously there's other kind of downhill mountain biking and as such. But today we're going to talk mostly about road cycling because as professional advisors, that's where we see most of the income. It's definitely the highest paid part of the sport. And yeah, I mean, it's something that I've admired for a long time. I've never been a very successful cyclist, but I've dabbled at the odd triathlon, and you really start to realize how physically grueling a sport it can be. Anyone who's ever tried to look at the kind of VO2 max thresholds and fitness levels, if you look at the records, you start to see how cyclists kind of top those records quite across the board. And it's just because it is such a physically grueling sport, very demanding on the body, and therefore, as I say, some of the most well-respected athletes in the world of sport. Quite remarkably as well, I wasn't aware of this until recently, the Tour de France, obviously now just started, is the third most watched sporting event in the world, behind the World Cup and the Summer Olympics, gathering usually about 3 to 4 billion viewers each year, which is quite remarkable. It's a sport that runs throughout the season. Lots of events take place throughout the year, so obviously lots of different people from around the world watching, a huge fan base. Some of the bigger events include the monuments towards the beginning of the year, so kind of the one-day events taking place in places like Italy, France, Belgium, and then obviously you have the Grand Tours later on in the year. It's still predominantly a European-based sport in terms of where the main events and where the main riders are based, but it is a very international sport as well. We get a lot of riders from all over the world competing. And then just to add, I guess, as well, something that we've seen definitely pick up in the last few years is the success of with the women's side. The larger events are now kind of pushing the women's sport. We're definitely getting a lot more referrals from female clients in the professional cycling space who want advice, similar to how we've provided that advice to the men in the past. So that's amazing to see that those kind of the contracts and the income levels are starting to increase and be recognized there. So yeah, hopefully that continues.
Absolutely. And I was kind of blown away by those viewing figures to the Tour de France. I hadn't recognized that it was so popular. So with such a global profile, what is the earning landscape like for the cyclists? Can you talk us through how the top stars get paid and then perhaps moving on to more junior riders?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not surprising that obviously you've got some of the top stars on kind of multi-million pound contracts. Obviously, I think most people who know a bit about cycling will understand that Tadej Pogačar is probably the most successful rider of the last few years, and of course, based on that, the highest paid athlete in the sport at the moment. He probably earns in the region of 10 to 12 million euros a year from kind of team based fees, obviously with his team UAE paying him that fee annually. He'll then have his own personal sponsorships as well, albeit a lot of the sponsorship does go through the team and the riders tend to have just a few other smaller bits on the side. But that's a world away from what you see at the junior end. It's really is, you see kind of world tour riders competing on the international stage at places like the Tour de France, making really not much more than what you would see as minimum wage. Obviously, as a very early junior, you don't really mind that so much. But if you compare it to sports like football, where there might be quite a large introductory salary, a lot of these riders will actually benefit from what the UCI set as a threshold minimum salary per year, which is generally around 35,000 euros. Now, that's not across the board. We tend to see the average world tour salary for a professional rider about the 500,000 euro per year. But you do see kind of only a very few number hit those top 10 million plus mark, and a few do hit those really low marks. But yeah, there's a huge disparity between the top and the bottom who are riding next to each other essentially on the road.
Absolutely, and that doesn't feel like a huge reward given the level of physical input required into a sport such as cycling. But I suppose you have to go through that apprenticeship stage to get to the multi-millions. It's probably worth us highlighting the UK's rich history in cycling. So, should we touch on the kind of major successes over the years, particularly the recent years for GB, and who might be emerging as the next generation of top stars?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is really exciting part of it. Again, focusing on cycling, we've got incredible history on the track in the Olympics and World Championships, which I won't be going into just here. But I mean, look at the history of the sport, even just quite recently, and you look at Mark Cavendish recently breaking the record for the total number of stage wins at the Tour de France, which is a huge successful story for him, and coming back from a lot of injury and retirement, and hitting that record. Obviously, we've had huge success with the likes of Bradley Wiggins being the first ever British person to win the Tour de France over the whole event, and then Chris Froome following that up with 4 wins, becoming one of the most successful of all time. And also on the women's side, I mean, we've got Lizzie Deignan in the UK, who's had a huge amount of success over her career, becoming world champion, and like I mentioned earlier, with those big monument events early in the season, she's had multiple wins across that classics season. So yeah, amazing across the board. Really, we've had such a huge amount of success, which is always amazing in the UK. And then yeah, it's also very exciting looking forward. I mean, we've got a lot of brilliant young talent who are already performing at the highest level, the likes of Josh Tarling and Pfeiffer Georgie, Tom Pidcock, Cat Ferguson, Matthew Brennan, all really, really shining a bright light on the sport for the UK. So really excited to see what they can continue to do in the future.
Absolutely. Exciting times ahead. But sorry to bring you away from the exciting side and to turn back to, I guess, our side of the cycling world. So, looking at the more advisory side of what we do, for the cyclists themselves, what are the employment status or structures for the riders?
Yeah, so the starting point is the fact that if you are going to ride for a world tour team, so you know these are the big teams that pay the big bucks and get into the big events. They're all fairly heavily regulated by the UCI, the international governing body for cyclists, and that's a body based out of France. It does obviously regulate international cycling, but it's based out of France, and France has got quite a heavy kind of social security type remit in terms of its tax laws, and it does push this kind of employee employer relationship between the riders, and it likes to consider that you know there's certain protections in place for these riders. That doesn't necessarily mean that's the case across the board. We do see a lot of riders who ride for teams on a self-employed basis, and it generally falls down to where the rider is based and where the team are based. But as I say, the UCI regulations do dictate not just the kind of the structure of how the contract is between the parties, but also the ability to use personal service companies, which we see a lot in sports and other areas of tax. And also, just like I said earlier, like kind of minimum thresholds for income and, you know, protections from an insurance point of view. So that kind of leads the way in terms of how the structures are set up. And then obviously the riders themselves take advice on what works for them in terms of, you know, where to be based and how they're going to benefit from the long-term contracts that they end up signing with the teams. And that's a key point, is they do tend to sign these kind of not just 1 year contracts. They tend to sign, once they've been a bit more successful, 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5+ year contracts with teams, or maybe lifetime contracts we've seen sometimes. And that can have a little bit of an impact on the tax implications of how that contract is structured and how it's taxed, essentially. Again, depending on where the rider is based and where the team is based.
And that moves us on nicely, actually, to the next section, which is to talk about the tax considerations that the cyclists face. So you talked about the commercial agreements and signing a new deal, and whether that's a multi-year deal or a 1 year deal. But how do the lifestyle choices that the riders make, particularly around where they might live, impact on their tax obligations?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the questions we get asked the most is, you know, I'm starting to do well in my career now as a cyclist. Where should I base myself? And the first question we ask is, well, where do you want to base yourself? Where do you think the best training environment is for you? Where do you think you'll be best suited? Where a family? Typically, cyclists are globally mobile. They travel around the world. They spend so much time training that it doesn't really matter where they live, as long as they can, get around easily and have a good environment on their doorstep to train. So obviously, a lot of them move away from the UK purely because of the geography, and we haven't got enough hilly open roads to train on. So they move to kind of mountainous regions. And once you start to look at mountainous regions, they think, well, okay, where are the best ones in Central Europe that I can get around to all of these events? And no surprise, places like Andorra in the Pyrenees and Monaco, right on the southern cusp of the Alps, do come up as possible locations. And obviously, that's not just to do with the geography; that's to do with the fact that they provide a really advantageous tax regime. Like a lot of other our clients who are athletes, they have these people have a very short opportunity. They have a very short window to earn the maximum potential. And so, they can move to these places and then benefit from a lower tax rate, which helps them maximize their earnings over that period, meaning that when they retire into their 30s or so, they've got that buffer of earnings that they've been able to maximize. So, yeah, I mean, being globally mobile, they look at all the places. A lot of people ask us about the Middle East and Dubai, obviously, prior to events going on at the moment, whether that should be a place. And the first question you ask is, well, what's the training regime out there like? And so it's very flat and it's very dusty and it's very hot to be training. So usually most of them fairly put off by that as soon as you mention that. And also the travel is less advantageous, despite there being some big events out there these days. So yeah, I mean, that tends to be the typical advice we work with these people on, and what they ask is where they should be based. Once you've got that set up, it can help to move on to things like, then structuring and reviewing the contract and making sure that things are worded in a way and planned in a way that suits them and meets their lifestyle and helps them from a tax point of view. But it's worth noting as well that, like we discussed in the motorsport podcast previously, these are globally mobile athletes. They're subject to a very specific set of tax rules around the world. Generally, they're taxed where they perform. And so again, we help them with that kind of part of it. If they are racing in the UK, if they're racing in France and Italy, these are places that will want to tax them despite them living outside of those countries, based on the events that they perform at in those countries. So again, helping them with the planning for that, record keeping, filing tax returns and so on, and also just planning the year ahead, which leads on to things like, if you're going to live in one of these countries or move abroad, you do really need to consider how easy it is to travel around. So things like, will you be able to get a visa? Living in Europe is a big plus these days for these professional athletes, because the UK doesn't necessarily give them that ability to travel in Europe freely. So moving to somewhere that does have that ability to move around is great for them, and they much prefer that once they've settled. So yeah, I mean, it can depend on a lot of things: environment, training regime, tax. They all come into it, and it's generally a conversation that builds over a few weeks or months, and then they start to make a decision, and we can advise on the back of that.
Excellent. Yeah. And you touched on the global tax compliance aspect there, which is something we do for a number of our clients. So, what are the worldwide tax exposures for these guys?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, the international mobility of these riders means that they can go and do a day's work in a country, and the tax authorities might come after them. And again, it falls down to, in the UK, we have these foreign entertainers rules. So we have a domestic set of legislation that means that if you are a foreign entertainer and you come and perform in your character in the UK, then you would be taxed on a proportion of the income that is attributed to that performance. And so, when you've got riders going to the Tour de France, they will pay tax in France. When they're going to the Giro d'Italia in Italy, they will pay tax in Italy on that. And it's the same around the world. The individuals will generally have tax obligations in all of these countries. It depends on a number of things. Sometimes the teams will have to withhold the tax at source. So, for instance, again, using the UK as an example, the domestic legislation requires that if a team is paying a rider, no matter where the team is based around the world, no matter where the rider is based around the world, if a payment is made in connection with the performance in the UK, the team must withhold 20% basic rate tax from the proportion of income that relates to the UK performance. Likewise, that's the case in a few other countries around the world. It's a bit different in other places. Somewhere like Italy doesn't require a withholding tax necessarily unless the team is based there, but the rider might still have a filing obligation to report a tax return and pay taxes there, depending on the level of work they do there. And I mentioned it's linked to performances in that country. We have to apportion income. These riders are paid an annual fee. It doesn't necessarily relate specifically to a performance in a territory. So we will consider apportioning income based on things like, where the days were carried out, the days of work, but also we can track things like, training days and where they were carried out, which if they're carried out in somewhere like Andorra where the rider lives, that can help reduce the exposure to tax in those other countries where they then perform, because the training is essentially part of the work for these people. So that can pull more of the tax exposure out back to their home country. So yeah, it depends on a lot of different things. And yeah, it's a moving situation at the moment with more countries looking at this type of thing. And we'll come on to that in a bit.
Yeah. And you mentioned the filing regime in the UK, the Foreign Entertainers Unit, briefly there. As we know, next year's Tour de France starts in the UK. So what UK considerations will the riders have to be aware of, in particular because of the Grand Depart?
Yeah, again, massively exciting for UK sport, hosting the Grand Depart. Obviously, it did take place in Yorkshire a few years ago, and people were out on the street in mass supporting it. It drew a huge crowd. So yeah, amazing and exciting that it's happening again next year, 2027. We've got it back, and it's going to take place over 3 days. I believe the schedule is to take place in 3 days, one in Scotland, Wales, and England, and that's across, I think, both the men's and women's. And so the Tour de France Femmes will take place usually after the men's. We'll do the same thing. So what we've got here is we've got a number of days for a very high profile event taking place in the UK, where a number of the highest paid athletes in the sport will be coming to the UK and performing. And so I would expect HMRC to keep a very close eye on that and make sure that, those high earners are reporting the UK work days accordingly, because again, it's about apportioning that income. If you are paid an annual fee, and that annual fee includes your services racing at the Tour de France, obviously you've got 21 days across the Tour de France. There's some rest days in there, but 3 of those are now taxable in the UK. So again, it's that apportionment and how that's worked out. As I mentioned, HMRC will generally apportion it based on event days to start with. So if you take 3 days racing in the UK and you do 100 days racing throughout the globe in a year, then you've got 3% of your fee taxable here. What we like to try and do is incorporate other elements of the job. These people are not just working for 100 days a year. They are training day in, day out. They're doing various other commitments for the team and their other sponsors. So we'll bring all that in. And that's where, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to keep really good records and track training and other duties. Slightly separately from the apportionment method, if, for instance, someone wins a stage at the Tour de France Grand Depart in the UK and they win a bonus for that, let's say, I don't know, someone gets a €10,000 bonus for winning a stage. If that took place in the UK, that is UK sourced. That is 100% taxable in the UK. So that €10,000 is taxable in the UK because it relates specifically to a UK event. That's the bit that can sometimes catch people out. They don't understand that these large bonus one-off payments can get caught by UK tax if they are 100% related to that particular performance day. And again, this isn't just the UK, this is elsewhere in the world, but obviously for the Grand Depart next year, that'll be a very high profile event, and we'd expect some of the riders to have to file tax returns. And there are some lower thresholds. There's no withholding requirement if the total UK income is below the personal allowance, which is obviously about 12,500. There are some treaty reliefs if you're resident in a country and you earn below a certain threshold, but they're very rare. And generally speaking, so long as you've had withholding tax deducted at the basic rate and you don't become a high rate taxpayer by your income exceeding that kind of 50,000 threshold, then you shouldn't really have any more tax to pay. But obviously for the highest earners, if you're earning kind of million plus and you have an apportionment of income to the UK, then that can quickly take you well over the personal allowance and also well into the higher rate threshold. And that's again where it's going to be important to keep records and claim expenses at that point to try and bring that taxable income down.
Yeah, and you mentioned the training days and keeping a record, and that's something that's important from a UK perspective, which often isn't for other territories. But whereas we've had these conversations with athletes in certain sports before, let's say a 100-meter runner or a boxer who might not necessarily have a detailed log of everything they've done. I think with a cyclist, with the maintaining the performance data, I think that's often easier, isn't it, to get hold of that information because the teams will log that meticulously, which is helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah. These riders are given their computers to attach to their bikes, and the teams want to have all that data. So yeah, it's usually available. And also just things like Strava, a lot of these
Mm.
riders will, keep records of their own personal training to show to their fans. So, there's a lot of data out there for these individuals that we can rely on when it comes to proving that training data to HMRC and to some of the other tax
Yeah.
territories.
And last one, I think, from me. So you touched on it again briefly in terms of the increase in scrutiny we're seeing from various tax authorities in other jurisdictions. Could you give us a bit more color on that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's no surprise and no shock to anyone that tax is becoming more and more political these days, and also because of the growing cross-border cooperation between various tax authorities and countries around the world. They are speaking to one another. They're sharing data, and so we do see more and more questions being raised now as to whether countries that have the ability to tax the riders are getting the tax that they should be, whether there's enough guidance and knowledge out there for these riders who maybe don't have international tax advisors be filing and paying tax in the correct places, but also those who have grown in popularity and income levels are then getting that information at the right time. But also there's ongoing scrutiny from countries that might not have previously taxed these riders, who might be looking at their own legislation and starting to think, well, maybe we should be. But likewise, go the other way. Some tax authorities may start to look at, well, maybe we should offer reliefs to try and encourage people to come to our country and provide these performances that bring in a huge amount of money for the economy. We see that with some of the major sporting events around the world, like the Olympics and the World Cup. Often countries will be obliged, but also will usually want to try and provide tax relief to encourage as many people to come as possible to perform in their country, because it is such a huge boom for the local economy. So yes, there is added scrutiny, and yes, it's something that has to be considered carefully by these athletes, especially because they're so high profile and they really don't want to be having their name spread across the press in a negative way because of something like tax. But yeah, I mean, the types of questions we start to see is not just whether tax should be paid, but it's how it should be paid. And so again, it goes back to that allocation of income and what should be taxed and what shouldn't be. In the UK, we're quite strict. We don't just tax prize money, fee money, things like that. We also want to tax an allocation of endorsement money. So, if you come to the UK and perform on track, on the road, whatever it is, and even if you make absolutely no money for that, but you have an endorsement contract elsewhere, a proportion of that will be taxable in the UK. So again, it's something that we have to be careful of. And then other things like, making sure tax residency is kept on track so people don't accidentally spend too much time in a country. The tax authorities do have a lot of data in that regard, so they will keep on top of people if they think someone's spending too much time in a country, especially, if you're living in Monaco, spending time in France, if you're living in Andorra, spending time in Spain. They do keep on top of this stuff. And likewise, if you're a UK citizen who comes back to the UK a lot, making sure you stick below the relevant thresholds not to trip up there. And then a very final quick point is that whole employment versus self-employment classification that I mentioned at the beginning. There is a difference and it does need to be considered in the contract. It can go either way, but it is just dependent on locations and where people are based.
Perfect. Thank you for that, James. That was my last question. Before we wrap up, is there anything else we want to highlight as a parting shot for our listeners?
Yeah, so the couple of interesting points. One tax, one non-tax. So obviously, we do also work with a number of other athletes across a number of sports, and obviously we do see a lot of talk and questions around image rights. It's something that we do see in cycling, where you have cyclists who are kind of caught by that employment relationship. We do see cyclists try to split out an element of their income for image rights purposes to show that there is just a payment for riding and there is a payment separately for, promoting the team and the sponsors and for providing that personal sponsorship side of things. So that's something that we can consider. And obviously we're aware that in the UK, HMRC are consulting on things like whether that should be looked at more carefully, and we keep a close eye on that. But we'll see. But it's still something that's quite big in the cycling world. And then, as I say, a little bit more exciting on a non-tax side, we Saffery are hosting an amazing event in September. So from the 3rd to the 6th of September, we're co-hosting a London to Paris cycling ride for charity in support of Action Medical Research, which is big in the cycling community. And we've got over 50 people registered, but I am told that there's still space if anyone wants to join. And we're delighted that we're able to be joined by Lizzie Deignan, the, as I say, world champion women's racer recently retired, and she'll be joining. So yeah, I'm hugely excited for that. And so if anyone does have any questions about that or thinks they want to join, then give us a shout and we'll put you in touch with the team that are handling that.
Sounds like a great event. I think one for me to be viewing rather than taking part in there. Before we go, you know the format of this podcast well enough, James. I'm going to need a prediction from you on something. So the Tour de France just started. Who wins it this year?
I mean, it'd be silly not to say Tadej. I think could be a monumental ride from him this year. He's been winning everything. He's got more points than many of the other top riders combined. He's on form. Jonas has had a good year, but I think it'll be a struggle, and I think Tadej will wrap it up and cement himself as probably the greatest ever road cyclist of any generation. I personally think he already is, but yeah, I think that would seal the deal, quite frankly.
Excellent. Well, let's see whether that comes to pass. Thank you again, James. That's a really good summary of the challenges and issues that cyclists have to navigate. As ever, we should note that this is a complex area of tax, and you should always take professional advice, ideally from us. And that's all from this episode of Tax in the Spotlight. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our show. And if you have any questions on today's topic or to find out more about us, please head to www.saffery.com and drop us a line. Thanks again for listening. Bye.